The child stepped down from the train wearing a cardboard tag, a number, a first name perhaps, sometimes an age guessed by someone else, sometimes an age guessed by someone else, sometimes a note pinned to a coat that was not originally theirs. On paper, it looked orderly. A child had been listed, assigned, transported, received, but order on paper is not the same as continuity in life. And when the train pulled away from the platform, what often remained in the dust was not just a frightened boy or girl in a new town. What remained was the beginning of a disappearance. Not always of the body, of the name, of the family line, of the bridge back home. For decades, the orphan trains have been remembered in the safest possible language. Children rescued from crowded eastern cities, young lives given fresh starts in healthier places. A noble reform, a practical answer to urban poverty. And in part, that was true. Some children were fed, housed, educated, loved. Some found stability they might never have known otherwise, but that is not the whole story. It never was. Because hidden inside the orphan train movement was a quieter pattern, one less easy to celebrate. Children who could not find their families later, not because distance alone separated them, but because the record of who they had been began to dissolve almost as soon as they arrived. The names they erased. That is where this story begins. Not in a grand office in New York, not in a philanthropic report, not in the language of reform, but in the small humiliations and substitutions that happen when one child is transferred from one life into another. A surname shortened because local people could not pronounce it. A first name changed to please a new household. A middle name dropped. A birth date estimated. A Catholic child placed into a Protestant home and renamed for convenience. Brothers separated and entered under different spellings. A girl listed as Annie in one ledger and Anna in another, then Hannah in a county census 10 years later. A boy called Pietro in Manhattan becoming Peter in Ohio, then listed as Patrick after a foster father's death. Tiny changes, clerical changes, familiar changes. And yet, when repeated enough times across decades, they become something else, an erasure engine. Between the 1850s and the early 20th century, an estimated 250,000 children were sent westward from eastern cities to a network that later came to be known collectively as the orphan trains. The movement was associated most famously with the Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace, though other organizations, denominations, and local agencies became part of the larger pattern. The public logic was plain enough. Urban poverty was producing children who, in the eyes of reformers, were vulnerable to crime, vice, disease, and permanent destitution. Better, they believed, to place them with farm families and small-town households in the interior than leave them in crowded tenements, almshouses, or city streets. But even that opening explanation contains a misdirection, because many of the children were not orphans in the absolute sense. They had parents. Some had one surviving parent. Some had mothers who were poor rather than dead. Some had fathers who had disappeared into labor migration, prison, drink, illness, or another city. Some came from families broken by eviction, widowhood, epidemic, fire, or industrial injury. Some were surrendered temporarily and never returned. Some were placed by institutions that believed poverty itself had disqualified a family from keeping its children. That distinction matters. If a child is presented to the public as an orphan, separation appears natural. If the child has living family, separation becomes something else, a severance that can later be hidden by language. And language was one of the first tools used. Watch the words in the surviving records: placed out, indentured, apprenticed, adopted, though often not in the modern legal sense, received, taken, removed, bound, selected. The child passes through several vocabularies before arriving anywhere secure enough to be called home. In the process, identity becomes strangely flexible. Reformers wanted accountability on paper, but many local arrangements remained informal. County officials recorded what they heard. Foster parents used the names they preferred. Churches entered baptisms under new spellings. School registers reflected local custom rather than Eastern origin. By the time the child was old enough to ask who they had once been, the answer might exist only in a file hundreds of miles away or nowhere at all. This is the part of the story that disappears behind photographs. The pictures are famous now. Rows of children posed neatly before departure. Boys in caps, girls in plain dresses, faces turned toward the camera with that 19th century stillness that can look calm until you stare too long. The images give the illusion of documentation. They suggest that because children were photographed, counted, tagged, and sent under organizational supervision, their lives must have remained traceable. But a photograph is not a chain of custody. A child can be documented once and lost many times afterward. In some towns, the arrivals were treated almost like public events. Notices went out. Families gathered. Children were lined up in halls, depots, opera houses, or church basements. Adults inspected them, asked whether they could work, whether they were strong, whether they were obedient, whether they had good stock. In gentler retellings, this process is sanitized into selection. In harsher ones, it looks uncomfortably close to a market. And whatever word one prefers, the result was the same. Children were redistributed through a system that depended less on preserving identity than on securing placement. Placement first, continuity later, if ever. That is why names mattered so much. A name is not just a label. It is the thread by which family memory holds. Change it, and you do more than alter pronunciation. You alter searchability. You alter the ability of siblings to find one another, of mothers to write, of later descendants to reconstruct what happened. You shorten the bridge between one life and another until eventually there is no bridge at all, only two disconnected records and a silence in between. In one archived account from the broader orphan train era, a child remembered being told not to use her old surname because it was too foreign for the new place. In another, a brother and sister were separated and later listed under different family names in separate counties, making their reunion almost impossible without intervention. In others, children recalled being encouraged to call foster parents mother and father immediately, not always out of cruelty, but out of a belief that attachment required replacement. Yet replacement is not the same as healing. Sometimes it is simply administrative forgetting made intimate. And there were practical reasons families never found them again. Poverty had already disrupted the paper trail. Many poor families had unstable addresses, irregular contact with institutions, limited literacy, and little leverage over agencies that regarded them as morally suspect. Letters sent to Eastern tenements did not always reach anyone. Mothers who moved after eviction could vanish from the system. Surnames that had already shifted between immigrant languages and English were vulnerable to further distortion. A single wrong initial in a ledger could become fatal to later searches. The child who was Margaret O'Rourke in Manhattan might become Maggie Rourke in one register and Mary Rourke in another. A mother looking under the first name and spelling might never know the trail had continued under the third. Then there was secrecy. Reform institutions often operated under the conviction that rescue required distance from the old environment. In the best interpretation, they feared children being reclaimed into hardship. In the worst, they believed poor families had forfeited the right to continuity. Either way, the practical consequence was the same. Biological ties could be treated as obstacles to successful placement. That meant withholding information, limiting correspondence, or making reunification difficult unless intermediaries approved it. The moral language was uplift. The structural effect was severance. There is a scene recorded in several versions across orphan train memory, and whether each detail belongs to one child or many hardly matters. A girl asks for her mother's address. She is told it will be kept for safekeeping. Years later, she asks again and is told the papers cannot be found. Another child writes letters that are never answered, whether because they never arrived, because the mother had moved, or because someone decided silence was kinder than instability. No one can now say. Decades later, the grown child still wonders, was I abandoned or was I made unreachable? That question sits like a stone at the center of the whole history, because the movement was built on a genuine crisis. Urban poverty was real. Child homelessness was real. Disease, overcrowding, abandonment, and labor exploitation were real. Reformers did not invent those conditions. But systems created in response to suffering can still produce their own forms of damage. The Orphan trains addressed one emergency by normalizing another, the conversion of family fracture into administrative procedure. And once procedure takes over, human complexity is easily flattened. A child removed because a father died in an accident becomes an orphan. A child surrendered during a mother's illness becomes destitute. A child whose family spoke another language becomes unclaimed. Categories simplify the moral burden. They make the system easier to defend. They also make later truth harder to recover. By the 1880s and 1890s, the orphan train movement had spread across such a wide geography that tracking after-placement outcomes became uneven at best. Some organizations tried, some agents revisited placements, some reports were filed, but scale itself became a force of disappearance. Thousands of children across dozens of states moved through rail networks into households, farms, churches, county systems, and local record books, even without malice that produces fragmentation. With indifference, it produces oblivion. And this is where the lost records of the wider period deepen the mystery. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were full of vulnerable archives, local courthouse fires, changing jurisdictions, shifting ward boundaries, incomplete birth registration, inconsistent adoption laws, destroyed census materials, misfiled institutional records, and private agency papers that were never meant to survive as public memory. When an orphan train child went looking decades later, they were not searching through one clean national database. They were searching through a broken documentary landscape. A few surviving forms here, a church note there, a county ledger with the wrong spelling, a faded letter without an envelope, a train list with first names only, and sometimes not even that. What remains, then, are stories. The child who remembered a mother's red shawl but not her address. The boy who knew he had a sister named Rose somewhere west of the Mississippi and spent 40 years searching variations of a surname no clerk had preserved accurately. The woman who did not learn until late in life that she had not been an orphan at all, only the daughter of a widow who could not feed 3 children through one winter. The old man who said he had been given a new name before supper on the first day he reached his new home. That line, whether exact or remembered, contains the whole violence in miniature. Before supper, before trust, before belonging, before love, if love came. The old name, the one carrying the mother, the street, the language, the dead father, the siblings, the neighborhood priest, the tenement stair, the hand that had once buttoned the child's coat gone. Not legally annihilated, perhaps, but socially displaced, practically buried. And later, when the child became an adult and tried to return through memory, the return route no longer existed. This is why so many orphan train children never found their families. Not simply because the continent was large, though it was. Not simply because time passed, though it did. But because the connection points were deliberately or casually weakened at every stage. Poverty separated them. Reform renamed them. Placement scattered them. Records misfiled them. Institutions abstracted them. The archive failed them. And by the time adult children went back looking, they were often searching not for a family that had rejected them, but for one that had been made invisible. There is a temptation to force this into a single moral category, either a great benevolent rescue or a hidden atrocity. But history is often crueler than either label. It mixes care with arrogance, salvation with paternalism, tenderness with dispossession. Some foster parents loved the children they received. Some exploited them. Some agencies tried honestly to help. Some believed too deeply in their own right to decide which families deserved to continue. The system did not need universal malice to produce erasure. It only needed to value placement more than continuity. And perhaps that is the darker pattern concealed inside the orphan trains. Not that children were moved, but that once moved, they became easier to rewrite. By the early 20th century, many of the children had become adults living under names shaped by other households, other churches, other counties. They married, worked, had children, and buried questions they could not answer. In family memory, the silence often persisted for generations. She came from New York. He was on one of those trains. No one knew his real name. Such phrases survive in Midwestern and Western family histories like fragments from a cracked ledger. Enough to suggest rupture, not enough to repair it. Even today, descendants searching for orphan train ancestors often find the same wall, inconsistent names, approximate ages, sealed or missing records, and the recurring discovery that the person they called an orphan may have belonged to a family that never stopped looking. That is what gives the story its lingering ache. Somewhere in an eastern city, a mother may have waited for letters that never came. Somewhere in Iowa or Kansas or Indiana, a child may have repeated an old surname under the breath at night so it would not disappear completely. Somewhere in a file drawer, two versions of the same life sat side by side under different names while no one realized they belonged together. The names they erased, not always with cruelty, sometimes with certainty. Sometimes with haste, sometimes with the calm, administrative confidence that changing a name was a small thing compared to saving a child. But to change a name carelessly is to gamble with memory, and memory was the one possession these children could least afford to lose. In the end, that may be the true history of the orphan trains. Not only movement across geography, but movement across identity. Children carried from one region to another, then from one name to another, then from one story to another, until the original life became difficult to prove even to themselves. And once a child could no longer prove who they were, the world begins to decide it for them. That is why the archives still matter. The old placement cards, the church books, the train notices, the letters from adults who, decades later, were still searching. Not because every mystery can now be solved. Many cannot. Too much was misplaced, burned, sealed, simplified, or never written down with enough care, but because each surviving fragment pushes back against the clean myth. It reminds us that what was presented as rescue often contained an unspoken trade, safety, perhaps, in exchange for traceability, a future, perhaps, in exchange for origin. And for many children, origin was the part that never came back. So if there is a final image to hold on to, it may not be the train itself, not the smoke, not the platform, not the line of children in clean clothes prepared for public selection. It may be something smaller, a grown woman decades later opening a courthouse drawer, an old man unfolding a letter with 3 different spellings of his own name, a descendant staring at a record and realizing the family story broke, not because there was nothing before it, but because the thread had been cut. Sometimes history does not bury people beneath ruins. Sometimes it buries them beneath paperwork. And sometimes the deepest loss is not the home a child left behind, but the name that would have allowed them to find it again. If this story leaves anything behind, let it be that recognition. That records are not neutral when children are moved through systems of power. That names are not minor details. That continuity is a form of mercy, and that when a society congratulates itself for saving children, it must also ask what it allowed itself to take from them in the process. Because somewhere in the silence between 2 surnames, between one ledger and the next, between a mother's memory and the county record, the orphan train story becomes something larger than migration or reform. It becomes a lesson in how easily people can be lost without ever disappearing, not by distance alone, by erasure.